Hello, everybody out there in nonprofit land. I'm making this recording for a friend who needs this section of my NPSP lectures. So we're here to talk about volunteers for Salesforce plus NPSP. So I've already given lectures on people and households and organizations and money. So this is the fourth lecture on using the nonprofit success pack. Volunteers for Salesforce is technically a separate package, but it comes pre-installed with all power of 10 organizations that opt to have NPSP pre-installed. So anyway, let's get going. I have drawn 4 objects on this board here that are the main objects that you need to understand as you talk about volunteers for Salesforce. So the first is, at the heart of it is this object right here, volunteer hour. I use the abbreviation VH for it. Volunteer hour is the thing that represents actual volunteerism. There's no volunteerism planned or completed until there's a volunteer hour. Now, a volunteer hour is attached to a contact or a lead. That's really up to you. And let's draw that. It always has to be attached to such a thing. And then we always have to attach a volunteer hour to a job. I like to say the job is where they did it. You can say it's what they did if you want, but it's what and where they did it if you want to say that. Volunteer hour has to have a job and has to have a lead or a contact, your choice. And then a volunteer hour may have a shift, which is when they are planned to fill some need you have. So that's an optional thing. And the reason it's optional is because there's the actual time that they do it is recorded on the volunteer hour. They start at this time and they spent this much time. But the shift is your planned need. A shift is a means of describing your future needs and trying to fill those needs with a plan. And the volunteer hour sort of is something that is attached to the shift in order to meet that need. And I might add the volunteer shift is always attached to a job. All right. Now there's one more object connection here, and that's the campaign. Oddly, jobs are always attached to a campaign. So I think the general thinking was that maybe all the volunteer jobs were associated with an event that you might be planning. And so you create a campaign for the event, you create the jobs, you create the shifts, and then people sign up, which creates volunteer hours and connects it to leads and campaigns, and it's all good. As a side effect of all of that, the leads and campaigns the leads and contacts are on that volunteer campaign. So it is possible to have status and to have email contact, or anyway, you can do all the things with that list of volunteers for that particular volunteer campaign that you can do with a regular campaign. Okay, so that's kind of the overall data structure. Volunteer hour is at the center of it, remember, this thing. And then we have, it must be attached to a lead or a contact, and it must be attached to a job, and it optionally is attached to the shift. And let's go back. Let me switch to a different format here and cover some things. All right, so all of this stuff is in a managed package. It's pre-installed in every NPSP pre-installed setup. You if you installed NPSP yourself, it will not be installed, and you have to install it yourself. The volunteer hour connects the person to the volunteer job and describes the time they started, the work duration, and the status, such as signed up, confirmed, cancel, or completed. You can absolutely customize the volunteer hour. I've done extensive customizations. You can add record types to it without fear. You can add additional fields without fear. You don't want to change the meaning of signed up, confirmed, and completed, but you may add other status fields if you want. You can add other values. For example, I have the need to know if volunteer hours are direct, meaning time spent with clients, or indirect, meaning behind the scenes. We use volunteer hours to also track training, and so we say that's neither direct hours nor indirect hours, but training hours. And we have a workflow rule that anytime we change those three custom fields that are added, it simply adds them up and puts them in the standard field that comes. That's the number of hours that are worked or the duration. There is a multiplier built into the volunteer hour that's a little odd. The volunteer hour can represent a group of volunteers, which is a little odd in that it's connected to an entity which we think of as a person or a lead. But nevertheless, you can think of a person, a contact, or a lead as having brought you 20 volunteers who work for 2 hours, and so you can say the duration is 2 hours, the number of volunteers is 20, and volunteers for Salesforce will take care of the rest and realize that you had 40 total hours of volunteerism. It's mostly an impact tracking thing. I personally want to know the names of the volunteers. It's quite useful when we have, for example, children who we don't want to get personally identifying information from, and so we can just say, okay, they're a bunch of children. And it's useful when we have people who decide they must remain anonymous for whatever reasons. I've found a lot of uses for the volunteer hour object. I already mentioned that we use it to track training because that's people giving their time, even if it's not what we might consider traditional volunteerism. We use it to track participation by our clients in programming. Again, it's not really a case. It's not really some kind of, anyway. So we just use it to describe attendance. There are lots of people who use volunteer hour to describe attendance at classes. We actually, I don't think I would recommend this, but we actually allow the attribution of out-of-pocket expenses. So if somebody spends $10 parking, we mentioned that, that they made an out-of-pocket expense of $10, so we can sort of measure impact that way. That's probably that's fine. If they donate things, it's probably better captured as an in-kind opportunity for better reporting. But anyway, so that's the volunteer hour. Lots of good uses for it. It's the middle of this diagram. So now let's go back to the diagram and think. So we've talked about the volunteer hour. Now let's go talk about the job. So a volunteer job describes the custom object. It's managed. It describes the where, and if you want, the what. I'm cautious about saying the what because different shifts can have actually different jobs. You could have a job for the entire event, like volunteer at our cook-off, right? And you could have shifts for servers and shifts for cooks and shifts for cleanup and shifts for setup. And so the what in that particular case might be defined by the shift rather than the job. Or you could choose to architect it as 4 different jobs attached to the same campaign, in which case the volunteer job is not only the what but the where also. So anyway, and of course, if all the jobs, if all the shifts for a job are happening all at once, it's also the when. But I'm just trying to give you the understanding. Um, if you want, different jobs can have different skills associated with them. You can. It's just a pick list that you edit. You can make the skills be whatever you want. Um, and as I mentioned, every volunteer job has a campaign. It's actually a master detail relationship, so it must have a campaign. Um, and that campaign actually has a special record type called a volunteer campaign. So Volunteers for Salesforce creates a campaign type called volunteer campaign. And I mention all of this because this complicates the use of the whole Volunteers for Salesforce function. There's some good benefits to attaching it to campaigns, but there are some complications. A campaign means marketing user, and a campaign is an object that is not covered by all licenses and all capability sets that Salesforce provides. So you may run into problems with a volunteer for Salesforce user needing access to campaign and needing a higher level license than they might otherwise need. And I have, for example, I have heard that if you're trying to involve volunteers for Salesforce inside of a community, it elevates the type of community license you have to have. I have experienced myself that if you try to use a flow and make that flow visible on a site, it significantly changes the permissions you have to give the guest site user. So it's important to understand that. All right, so now let's go to the volunteer person itself. Um, it's a person, so it's a standard contact or a lead. Doesn't really matter, but do remember that a lead is a substandard object in the NPSP world with no affiliations and no relationships. In particular, you'll probably want to figure out how to pretty automatically assign all the volunteers on a certain day to a certain affiliation because people tend to volunteer in groups from the same place. So, Volunteers for Salesforce contains no particular group volunteer functions other than you can say that that job was filled by a volunteer hour that had 50 people on it, but you can't identify who those people were or anything like that. So there's no particular group functions. You may find you have to instill some discipline or provide some automation assistance to add an affiliation to everyone, on certain times of volunteerism in order to fully capture that information, or maybe have other ways to capture it. But anyway, I don't recommend that you make record types for people who volunteer because you're hoping volunteers become donors or, clients become volunteers or whatever. But if you absolutely have exclusivity, volunteers are never anything else. I can't imagine that situation. You might make a special record type, but be careful about that. You can easily tell if someone is a volunteer because Volunteers for Salesforce has a bunch of roll-up fields that it adds to the contact that will tell you how many volunteer events they have completed and how many volunteer hours they have contributed. There's a field or two on there. There's a volunteer status field, but really it does nothing to it other than set it to active if they register. So you can change that field as you like afterwards. But anyway, you can attempt to figure out whether people are volunteering or not using those fields. In particular, have they given you volunteer hours and have they attended volunteer events? One little gotcha there is if you have a future volunteer hour that you have not yet completed, it will not flag you as a volunteer. Hence, the volunteer flag status pick list value might be useful in that case. Let's see. Each contact, and I think lead comes equipped with a skill and availability pick list that you can customize. You can set it or you can expose it to your volunteers in some form or some way, and they could fill it out. Volunteers for Salesforce doesn't particularly do anything with it other than that. We'll talk a little bit about that later, but So there are some customizations to the contact object, but it's not a record type, and I don't recommend making it one. And there are a few things that are added. Um, Volunteers for Salesforce never marks a volunteer inactive. So that's up to you, but it does mark them as active. Um, and I think we've mentioned most of the summary fields. It does come with a couple others. I believe there's a first volunteer date, and I believe there's a last volunteer date, and a few others. Those would probably allow you to, for example, give some kind of aggregate view of a contact or leads volunteer activity. It would allow you to begin to automate engagement plans with new volunteers, or using some other type of trigger trigger some engagement plans for inactive volunteers. Volunteers for Salesforce doesn't come with any of that engagement piece, but it provides some of the aggregate view fields to allow that to happen. All right, so we've talked about this object over here, and we've talked about this object, we've talked about this object, we've talked about this object. This shift thing, let's dig into that a little bit. It it comes up because there's a couple of things to mention about the volunteer campaign. I already mentioned that there's a record type in campaigns, and I mentioned it can cause trouble. It does add a whole lot of roll-up fields to your campaign object. So if you're sensitive to that, that's just kind of the way it is. Do bear in mind that by contacting Salesforce, you can get the roll-up summary limit increased on the campaign and contact object, and you may want to because NPSP has a whole lot of roll-up objects on the contact, and Volunteers for Salesforce adds some more, and on the campaign, so you may want to increase those. All right, so on to the shift, and this comes up in the general category of recurrence. Technically, you could create shifts manually, but I don't know why anybody. Well, you would only do so in a very simple scenario where perhaps you're doing something akin to having one campaign that has a few jobs and a few shifts, and you're just sort of deep cloning the whole thing to next year or the whole thing to next month, and that makes sense. And feel free to do that. We'll talk about that a little bit later, but for the most part, your shifts are going to be created by Volunteers for Salesforce using information you tell it about job recurrence. Job recurrence equals a series of shifts. That's what it means. So, for example, I can have a job that happens Monday through Friday every week, and I can create a job recurrence for it that says Monday through Friday every week at 11 a.m. for 2 hours, and attach it to a job. And now Volunteers for Salesforce will create shifts out into the future. It does this immediately when you modify it, and then it runs every night and updates. You get to tell it how far into the future to do it. It's a batch scheduled Apex job, and I believe by default it runs for 2 months. I'm sorry, it runs 2 months in advance. So if I say without any expiration date, this shift happens every week, you're going to come back and find 8 or 9 weeks worth of these shifts when you've finished editing, and or when and every night the batch job is going to run. In fact, it may not be every night; it may be once a week, and extend it by another so that it still covers how many ever months you set. And that's a parameter you can set. You can lower it. I tend to like to have at least a semester's worth of stuff out there. So we tend to run 4 months in advance. So job recurrence means a series of shifts having some kind of pattern, and Volunteers for Salesforce does not have every possible pattern that you might want. It has quite a few. It can do a lot of things. Just experiment with it. It can do every day of the week. It can do every Tuesday. It can do once a month on a certain day of the week. Those sorts of things. I don't believe it can do on the first of the month or the last of the month. I don't think it can do those. I think it can do first Tuesday of the month or whatever. But so it has a lot of those. You may have more than one recurrence. For example, I mean, we have jobs that are very similar to what I said. We have jobs that are every day. Well, actually, Tuesday through Friday, we have jobs, and we have a shift that starts at 11, 1, and 3. And so that's 3 recurrence schedules for that one job. And we schedule a semester in advance, so we actually have them end at a certain date. So, for example, the shifts that I have now end on August 15th. And so I have, for this particular assignment, I have 3 shifts that are Tuesday through Friday, start at 11 o'clock. Another shift starts at 1 o'clock, and another shift recurrence has 3 o'clock. So there's 3 of them, and they all end on August 15th. And now, when I make the new schedule, assuming we don't decide to change anything, and that's why we wait. We don't want anybody sign it up until we've decided. Assuming we don't decide not to change anything, I will simply copy those 3 volunteer recurrence schedules and add a new start date and change the end date to December, 20th or December, whatever. And it will create all those additional shifts for that same job. So that's how the job recurrence schedule works. It's called JRS. And so a JRS, let me draw it. A JRS can be attached to a shift. And that's it. It's just attached to the shift. And on the shift, it actually points back to the JRS. So if you look at the JRS, it'll show you the shifts that are there. Or if you go look at shift, you can click on the JRS that created it. And that all works great. Occasionally, for some unknown reason, your database may go a little haywire, and automatically created shifts can get disconnected. And in that case, unfortunately, the batch Apex job is going to go, well, hey, I don't find any volunteer shift for the time that's supposed to be, and it'll create another one. Duplicate shifts is known to happen. It hasn't happened to me in over a year. There were some known reasons. Perhaps it'll never happen again, but anyway, it used to happen, and it still could happen. All right. There's another kind of recurrence. Say you have a volunteer who says, you know what, I can work every first Tuesday of the month from 11 to 5. Sign me up. And so you have 3 options at that point. You can tell them they have to sign you up. We'll talk about that in a little while. Your internal person can sign them up, right? Or you can create what's called a volunteer recurrence schedule, a VRS, and you can let volunteers for Salesforce do it for you. So a VRS is has to be attached to the contact of the lead, and it specifies when they're available to work, what pattern they're available to work. Looks a lot like a job recurrence schedule, and it sounds a lot like it, so it's easy to confuse them. Remember, the V stands for the volunteer. The J stands for the job. And so if it is in place, when you save it or when the batch job runs, it will start signing them up for appropriate shifts that have availability and exist and match the time period that they said. And it has to match the time period that they said completely. So if I say I'm available from 1 to 5, frankly, I'm not sure what it'll do. It might very well sign me up for a shift from 1 to 3 and a shift from 3 to 5, or it might sign me up just for a shift from 1 to 3. I don't know. If I had a shift from 12:30 to 1:30, it absolutely would not sign me up. If I had a shift from 1 to 5:01, it absolutely would not sign me up. If the shift is full next week, it will not sign me up. So there's some smarts built into it. So it's kind of nice. In particular, it's nice if you choose to expose this via some type of interface to your users, it's really nice for them to know exactly what their schedule is. I find that volunteers often have to change their schedule, so it's not my favorite thing, but still. All right, so recurrence, we've talked about shift recurrence, which is the job recurrence, and hour recurrence, volunteer hour recurrence, which is the volunteer recurrence. Do remember that a volunteer hour does not have to be connected to a shift, but obviously it can't be a recurrence if there aren't shifts. If it is perfectly permissible to have jobs that are unplanned, you just have, call it office help, right? Somebody just comes in and does an hour of office help. You can have a job called office help. It has no shifts, and that would mean that no one can sign up for it. You don't have a capacity planning capability, right? But you can document that Susie came in at 2:30 and stayed till 5:30 and spent 3 hours, and that's all complete. You can document, but you can't sort of capacity plan without shifts. All right, that's kind of that, I think. All right, now, so that's the data structure. Notice we've covered everything on the page here. All right, so now let's talk about what's available in terms of web pages. And I'm going to go to a volunteer job here. This is one of our volunteer jobs, and what Volunteers for Salesforce provides is a sites page. If you've never used Site, and a lot of people haven't, it's a way of serving up public page, or it doesn't really matter, customized web pages at a Salesforce URL, and the page content is generated by Visualforce code somehow. And so Volunteers for Salesforce gives you some pages, and the pages are coded. You can style them with CSS, but they are quite complex, and they are not easily tweaked. They are not easily customized outside of what has been provided in terms of metadata-driven customization. They are, unfortunately, Sites is not a dynamic, a responsive web page, meaning it doesn't work very well on mobile phones or tablets. It's meant for a desktop browser. It sort of works on a phone, but it's just as good as the phone can do. It is definitely not responsive in the way that today's volunteer expects. So, fair warning. These pages are served up, and you must do some pretty heavy-duty configuration to configure all of this. It's covered exactly in the administration guide. It is very hard to get right. It's very detailed setup. You need to follow it exactly what it says. The administration guide is exactly right. It is completely precise, but it's really hard to get it right. So when it doesn't work, the failure mode is Salesforce just tells you don't have the right to see this, and you just see a under construction or an unavailable web page. What that really means is you have not set the security or the sites or the object permissions of the site user correctly. And the site user permissions are not set through profiles and permission sets. The guest site permissions are set inside of the site setup page. And the site setup page, frankly, is horrendously old and horrendously in need of redesign, but it is what it is. So the admin guide is exactly right. It's on the hub. There's tons of details there. If you don't get the expected results, you have not yet done it right, and you just need to start again, making sure that every single thing is done exactly the way it says there. The only known way to use the site is with an iframe or directly linking in a new browser window. So that's bad news. iframes aren't responsive, and on top of that, personal site, the sites aren't responsive anyway. And so, I don't know what to tell you there. Many people put it inside of an iframe and add some CSS to make it look like their website, and it looks great. And that's true as long as you don't get on a mobile phone with too small a size, and you don't get too crazy with how you've embedded it in the iframe. I think a lot of people probably just send the link to sign up, and I'm going to show you what it looks like. This is our link to volunteer for a particular job. And so I'm opening it now, and it's going to salesforce.com, and it's showing the drop-in helper information, the description, and what you might do, and the shifts that are available. There's 3 of those available, and there's 2 of those, and so on. Anyway, it's not pretty. That's kind of how it is. You can doll it up a little bit, but this is the kind of interface you're getting, and it is what it is, I think. So this is provided, and this is how people sign up. And you can potentially style this sign up thing a little bit. And when they click the sign up, you get a modal box that allows them to enter a minimal of information, first name, last name, and email, and hit the sign up button. Regrettably, if they hit it several times, you'll get a system failure one way or the other, either duplicate signups or they'll get an error. So that's what this kind of looks like. There is an interface that allows you to show a number of show this on a calendar format, a grid of days and weeks, like a calendar page. But in order to sign up, it's going to take you to a page that looks like this anyway. So those are kind of the 2 interfaces that are provided: calendar-ish page, and then a listing page like this. You can get a listing page like this that contains 1 job, or you can get a listing page like this that contains all the jobs on a particular campaign, or simply all the jobs that you have. In order for a job to be listed by the site, there's a box that has to be checked that says display on web. So you can have some jobs that cannot be displayed on the web. That's perfectly legitimate for internal use. We have lots of those at Street Youth Ministry. So we've talked about 2 pages, and I'll actually show you the page in a second. But I'll show you more of the page in a second. But so those are 2 of the pages. There is a sign up page. I can't show it to you because we didn't configure it, but there is a page. You'll notice that to sign up, it just asks for your email and first name and last name, and it's going to try to match you to a contact. By the way, if it doesn't find a contact, you can configure it to either make a lead or a contact. If you want to have registered people beforehand and collected more information, there is a Volunteers for Salesforce sort of registration page that you can expose. Again, iframe or direct link are the only known ways. And it collects information and creates a lead or a volunteer as you fit, or matches it to one that exists. The matching is not perfect, but it tries to look at the NPSP email fields to match. You will have to have somebody run duplicate checks and clean that up periodically, because volunteers can enter anything, and it doesn't always match, and they can vacillate between different email addresses, and result in duplicates. So you have to be watching for duplicates, but still it's a relatively self-service enterprise if you want to make it so. That's the point of the page, is to try to make a large, scalable, self-service enterprise of some sort. So they can register, then they can browse open shifts and sign up for shifts. There's no direct mechanism for canceling per se, unless you expose what's called the personal site. And let me find the personal site. I will go to my record. and expose the personal site. We've just made links, which are custom fields. It's not provided by volunteers for Salesforce. We added custom fields to compute the value of the links to the job so that we can just send somebody a sign-up link for a particular job if that's what they're corresponding with us about. Likewise, we have added the volunteer link as a computed custom field just so we can send it to them or open it for them. Let me scroll down here to our volunteer information, and I'll open the personal site link. By the way, having it as a formula field means we can also embed it in email addresses, which is typically how you would tell somebody about this capability. Once you've told them about it, trained them on it or something, you would expose this to them by some type of communication. And notice the way it works is, it's just one, well, all of these are just one page per type of page being served. As I said, it's Visualforce generating the page, so the Visualforce is only so complicated. This is the volunteer personal site, and it could be the volunteer personal site for anyone. What makes it the volunteer personal site for me is that a URL parameter of my contact ID has been passed into it. And to keep from people just typing in random contact ID fields and therefore exposing all of your private information, you should, I highly recommend, if you're going to turn this on, you absolutely should configure the additional security requirement that the contact ID matches the preferred email address of the person. That way this link is very hard to randomly come up with. So it lands on this page that shows them their personal information, and they can self-service update that. This personal information can be determined from a field set that you describe and set up. So you can actually customize this, what's shown and allowed for the volunteer to edit. It gives them a graph of their volunteer hours for the past. You can't change anything about what's displayed here, or how it computes it, but it goes and figures out what percentage ranking they have for volunteers, and it shows them some information which you can configure with another field set. We're choosing to tell them what their affiliations are and how many hours they have and when they all that stuff. And then it will show them their volunteer history. This is particularly good for people who need a certain number of volunteer hours for a purpose. They can go to this personal site and watch their hours accumulate and be sure that we've gotten them all and all that stuff. And they can see which ones they have, what they have now for scheduled times. And if they had anything already signed up, there would be a cancel button here. They can see the details of it and they can cancel. And so this is how volunteers can self-service cancel. Otherwise, you're stuck with finding another method to self-service cancel or do it by communication. So this is what's on the personal page. They can see a volunteer job listing, and it's all of the volunteer jobs you have. They can see a volunteer calendar. So this is what that calendar looks like for all of our jobs. You can't do a whole lot of customization of this. I don't think many people love how it looks, but it's kind of the way it is. You can, get it down to a week and a day in terms of sign up. But anyway, that's what it is. And the last thing you can do here, if you have people who are doing something for you in a fairly independent way. You have a trusted office worker who just comes in, has an assigned cubicle or desk, and they do work. You can set them up so that they are able to come in and self-report the hours that they spend with you. Here, I'll move this talking head. Well, I can't move the talking head. Oh yeah, I can. Okay. The only jobs they're going to be able to sign up for are the ones that they have done before. So, or at least, let me rephrase that. That's how I strongly suggest you set it up, because once it goes in the system, it looks just like any other volunteer hour. It's marked status complete. It's all done. And so you don't really, if they report that they did, if you have somebody who needs 40 hours of community service, once you've enabled this, they can just report, well, I did 40 hours and that is how it is. So it's on the honor system. To limit that a little bit, you can turn on something that only allows them to self-report volunteer jobs that they have previously completed at least one volunteer hour for. So that sort of narrows it down from an ease of use perspective as well as a accountability perspective. So that's how this personal site thing works. There's no print, there's no email, there's nothing else. This is not perfect. It's very functional, but it's absolutely not very pretty. And the user experience you can make it a lot prettier than we have, but there's only so much you can do to it. People have done really good jobs of matching their style, but you can't change the responsiveness and you can't redesign it. With the right consultant or development capability, you absolutely can rewrite. I mean, you absolutely can write a whole different interface. You can take the starting code. This is open source. You can take the starting code and modify it, but it is quite complex. So it's not something to enter into lightly. I think I might have covered everything about the web stuff. There's one more. I mentioned to you, you have to communicate this link to them because it's a static link. And once they have it, they can always go to that. Anyone who has that same link can go to it. They don't have to be them. So you pretty much want to communicate it to the person in a secure manner that you know that they're the only ones who receive it, such as email or text. And in order to facilitate that, there is a sites page provided by Volunteers for Salesforce that allows somebody to enter in their email address. And if it matches a legitimate volunteer, it will send them to their preferred email address the link that they need to use. Like I said, we have just simply embedded it in our volunteer communications so that the volunteer has, we call it the personal volunteer link, and they know to use it and save it and go to it. They do lose it from time to time, so we have to resend it to them. But we haven't embedded it anywhere for them to self-service get it again. But anyway, that's provided. Because of all the limitations of this web page stuff, there are some other solutions. Flows have been used, but be aware that in order to use a flow, you have to set up a site page and embed the flow on the site page or on actually you have to embed the flow in a Visualforce page and the Visualforce page in a site. And in order for that to work, you have to make sure the site user has all the permissions, including campaign object and so on. Otherwise, they won't be able to see the volunteer job and manipulate the volunteer job. So, because that's a master detail relationship, so access is controlled by the access to the volunteer campaign. Forms have been used. We use forms. Other automations can be used. I create first signups for the very first 2 volunteer times. We have a volunteer orientation course, and as part of that learning management system, we have a form that collects their information and when they want to come in and volunteer. And that form dumps information to a spreadsheet, which triggers Zapier, and Zapier creates some records all by itself. So you can do that. There also is a paid mobile app called Mobile Volunteers for Salesforce. I have never used it, but it does exist, that portends to provide both a mobile sign-up experience as well as a staff kind of mobile tablet or kiosk kind of way to check volunteers in. Volunteers for Salesforce does not have that sort of kiosks checking volunteers in all at once in mass functionality. That's often talked about as a missing feature. Okay, so that's kind of the web features. There's one more sort of aspect of Volunteers for Salesforce to talk about, and that's what I call the procedural features. Volunteers for Salesforce was written for an enterprise volunteer management where there is someone whose job it is to manage volunteers, that volunteer coordinator. And so there are some procedural functions that Volunteers for Salesforce provides for that volunteer coordinator. They can find people who have match certain availability and certain skills and add them to a campaign, job, or shift, I think, as prospective volunteers. They can communicate with volunteers and prospective volunteers on a campaign all at once. There's, I'm not saying these are, I personally find that these procedural functions are not flexible enough and are not modernized. Volunteers for Sales was written a long time ago. I don't think they're modernized enough to be that useful. I think today you could beat all of these functions with a list view and send list send, but you know they are provided. There is a grid-like mass update for all the volunteers on a campaign that you can configure and put on a page. I don't know how lightning friendly it is anymore, but it allows you to sort of update and mass update things. Again, I suspect you could do as well with a list view and mass edit today, but they are provided. They're quite limited. And in order to facilitate this volunteer coordinator, there actually is a user manual that's separate from the administration guide that describes how to do all this. So I've droned on and on and on about volunteers for Salesforce, but that's kind of how it all works. So now you know all about it. So good luck. Send me your questions. Bye.